So I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Frank Weichold from FDA.
Hi, good morning, everyone. If you look at the title, you realize that Bayer did something to me. He said, Frank, you have to talk about the clinical implications, and you need to bring us the perspective of the agency. And of course, you can wonder whether this is the right session to place it, but I'm actually happy I'm here because I know I have an audience of really serious scientists, and I want you to look at the subtitle that I gave my talk. I'm talking about lab data interoperability and the importance of it, which, of course, let's say you have made your new product, you understand what size you need in order to penetrate the tissue, you know what the release dynamic of your new medication is, and you go into a clinical setting. What's going to happen there? Well, first of all, there are tons of measurements that are constantly taken. And unfortunately, the ICU personnel, let's say you're treating acute situation patients, have very little support currently from AI, artificial intelligence, or algorithms to select out some of the critical information that is here captured as depicted in the different instruments that this patient is hooked up to. And that's a problem. It's a significant problem. It's a significant problem, and even though the print is a little small here, because we are actually taking hits, and I'm sorry for the color conversion and the slide conversion when I copied them. It didn't come over well. But I want you to pay attention, sorry, with the pointer. And one back at this. Just to put it in perspective, suicide's about 40,000. The opiate crisis takes about between 50 and 70,000 people now. This is an old slide from 2013, and it wasn't captured as such. But medical error is significant. And if you try to calculate how much we are actually losing and how much we are spending, the US is world champion in spending on our patients, but it doesn't necessarily translate into better outcomes. So we have to deal with this. And you can debate whether the $3,000 per person per year is the right number. And it doesn't matter because it translates not to each and every person at the same year, but it's an average. But it gives you a perspective of the economic impact. And as such, I would like to gain you as an advocate and as a champion for understanding how significant the problem is with clinical laboratory data. You've heard yesterday Professor Francis Richmond talking also about, during your development process, how much you should pay attention to preclinical data standards. And that's certainly very important. But when, from a perspective of the agency, when it comes to clinical development and when you provide data to us, that is something that is enormous. And unfortunately, very few people are aware of it. So that's why I use this time here at CLINAM to engage you in this discussion, because we need to find solutions. So what are the problems? Of course, weak foundations in terms of data governance. This is something we are struggling with. And when you talk about analyzing big data and creating artificial intelligence, if you have dirty data, you get misleading information, very misleading information. So if you think why clinical development and phase 3 studies often differ from the real-world evidence, as opposed to non-real-world evidence, I guess, that is created, that we then collect from the post-market, buy from different providers as the agency, in order to do our assessment to protect public health, we have a number of problems. And certainly investments into interoperability and data science is insufficient. And of course, we also have outdated systems. Now, data integrity is not addressed. And you would say, well, all of the clinical labs, though, are validated. They have to be certified. That's true for accuracy and all the criteria that you would care about, but not for uniform coding when they submit the information. And that's the problem, because you cannot trace the data back to the source data, and you don't know which instrumentation under which condition it actually was created. So I'm advocating also for unique identifiers, or BCOs, as it's called in the biocompute object metadata that links to the data set in clinical data. How much is lost? If personal data is untraceable, what kind of information can you extract from it? And if you just put yourself in your mind into a setting of a medium or small size hospital, from the different instrumentations that are used in order to monitor clinical data, there are many different systems and conversions. And if you really think about this in terms of clinical development, the instrument-measured data, the clinical data that are measured by an assay or an instrument, is actually the most valuable and actually most objective data, because anything else that is physician assessment and patient feedback is relatively subjective. And we yet have to learn a lot in terms of behavior science to understand the value and the strength of evidence that we get from patient information, even though we put it very high in our headlines in terms of 21st century cures and priorities to address patient needs and patient feedback. So I'm going to ride on this a little bit. So this is not necessarily to provoke you, but to think about this issue and also be an advocate for coming to terms here. If you just take an example for blood sugar test, the laboratory interoperability standard LOINC that is used has 915 different codes for glucose test. That's mind-boggling. And we see it all in clinical trials, not necessarily from the same sponsor, but I can tell you in submissions there are different codes for the same test, and then we have to sort it out. And most often, unfortunately, it's manual, and you can imagine how many errors there are. But I guess I'm jumping ahead because I'm coming to this it's a formula to get multiple errors introduced at many of the steps that are necessary. And of course, all those transformation steps in praxis have written and unwritten rules. And the worst of it is, in a submission, we don't know the rules because they are not part of the submission. So understanding health data for us, as well as the developer, is flawed, and we need to think how we change that. The costs, the losses, significant. And when I say in billions, I quote several of the people that we started discussions with from industry, but also from health providers, Central Medical Service, Medicare, Medicaid. We can just stipulate. I haven't really done a serious analysis. In fact, I'm actually keen on making some progress first because it's going to be scary. So, traceability, I mentioned, is very critical. And many people think, well, you know, we're going to work in the cloud, and of course, the converter box, the APIs, they can solve all the problems. Well, think about it, that's not true. If you have no traceability to the source data, what are you converting? What do you know? So, artificial intelligence, it's difficult to apply. It's dirty data. It's misleading. And in fact, it can lead to misrepresentation that's even worse than just understanding that you have a problem or that you don't have good data. So the impact, as the data increases, of course, this problem increases exponentially. And we need to address it now. And of course, I know, because you're all serious scientists that go to the facts, that's why you're here in this session. I already made my point. I don't have to convince you any further, but those are just some aspects that you also want to consider that has to do with this. We could improve a lot of things. Integration of data, automatic processing, all the manual very expensive part of the clinical development, namely that where you involve the contract research organization, clinical research organizations that charge any developer a lot of money for all this data transfer, is not necessary. And most importantly, to the benefit of the patients, if you do not have good algorithms that you can apply and artificial intelligence that can help you making decision at the site of decision, at the time when you need it because it's a life-threatening disease, coming back to my introductory slide, how many people we use to medical error. Those are the reasons. It's not because somebody forgot something. No, it's because the amount of data that occurs at one point in time for a single patient is so magnificent and complex that no single person, even in consultation with a team, can keep an eye on, let's say, on the average ICU is not a single patient unit, right? So, but it's everyone's problem. So, what we need to create is semantically interoperable systems that use authentic lab data, eliminates transcription errors, increase, of course, the speed of analysis, and we must build frameworks that reach interoperability consensus. In a way, we need to create new standards, and if not new standards, we need to use the existing standards like the LOINC and bring them up to speed so they truly serve our purposes and needs for dealing with larger data sets and modern medicine, because our public health system really depends on it. And if we really understand how significant this problem is, you are mind-boggled how few people are actually aware of it and how few people currently are trying to address it. So, of course, LOINC data, you know, are mainly generated for claims and reimbursement systems. However, that doesn't mean they couldn't be improved to really serve the clinical needs. There are certain kind of categories, I believe, that we have to create, including preferred terms and high-level terms, just because in some instances we have a need of summarizing certain categories of tests. For example, come back to my introductory, glucose levels. Of course, we need to have some high-level term to summarize all glucose testing, even if it's done with different systems. And we need to implement the submission of the original terms as generated by the lab instruments during the transit for the decision makers. We need systematically document data errors and resulting medical errors that result from the lack of comprehension of the results. We need to build comprehension of the data at the decision site for multiple users, and we need to implement advanced artificial intelligence processes to benefit that patient in that ICU that really needs that appropriate, timely, and scalable decision-making process. So, if we can do that, maybe we can improve public health in a significant way. Most importantly, we need to drive decisions in real time, and we need to be able to do also predictive analysis. Otherwise, we cannot get our hands on this. With that, I would like to thank you, but I also would like to thank my colleagues at FDA, in particular Anna Schorfman and Mitra Roca, who provided most of the background. I'm not a data guy, but I deal with regulatory science, and of course, as you know, I have a keen sense of creating collaborative and consortial systems that make an impact for public health. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions?
One of the issues in the US, we have got a privately insured system where people are concerned that their data will be used against them on the premiums, as opposed to a public system where it's looking at, isn't that a barrier to people sharing their own personal data?
Yeah, it's actually an antagonistic situation, truly. I'm not sure if you can solve it in near term, but you're right, a modern society shouldn't make profit from something that is a part of charité, is a part of humanity and part of development of a human society, namely to provide care for the sick and those in need. But that brings us back to a very deep philosophical discussion, and I don't think we can really go far in the few moments. But I agree with you. It's a conflict, difficult to address.
Frank, thank you for a disturbing talk, I think in the right way. I have a friend who is a consultant in an accidental emergency department in Scotland, and she has every morning to write down the fact that there may be mistakes in order to protect herself because of the inadequacy of the number of people she has to look after just too many people coming in the National Health Service. And I wonder whether or not all this data, or the data that you're providing, is almost adding to her problem. Because there is now so much information about the patient. Has anyone actually got the time in an emergency situation even to cope with this? Are we actually pushing people, the actual doctors, too far? And they're only human.
Well, that's a point that I try to get you at, because it's impossible for a human mind, even in a team setting, to make those decisions in a timely fashion, looking at the increasing data. And if someone of you had the chance to attend the talk yesterday about the clinical innovation and the opportunity of platform trials and standardized trials, is somewhat the same issue. Because the size of the data is constantly increasing, the complexity of the data is increasing. If we do not create systems that link back to the source data, that are traceable, that we have confidence in and are reproducible, where we also understand the limitations, we cannot apply AI systems or algorithms to support the team decisions or the person in charge of taking care of patients or human in need in a timely fashion. So the underlying basic of all artificial intelligence, decision-making algorithms, and providing good care is actually the quality and the traceability of the data back to the source data. And that's something we have not addressed in the US. There are some other national health systems that are in a better shape because they have a either linked or unique system where all the patients are traced. And if I'm at it, I also can say, and I said that yesterday, we don't have unique global patient identifiers. So when we at FDA analyze data that we buy from other institutions, because we don't have a way to collect them ourselves, we don't know if several of the patients show up several times. And because it's a commercial entity now, the databases are cloned, right? And it may actually go back to very few patients that are actually cloned several times, theoretically, if you think about it. It's an enormous problem. It's an enormous problem that people shy away to discuss.
To link up to the point, how do you foresee also to take into account the limitation within the clinical setting, aka hospitals, where there are other intrinsic aspects like transfer between the pharmacy, the general pharmacy, and the ICU is a major stop in hardware, where AI is not just even transferred. The two software are completely different, for instance, for security reasons.
Yeah, so the interoperability and accessibility of the information is not a technological issue, right? We have safe ways of transmitting data, and many of you have heard blockchain so many times that your ears form into blocks. But blockchain is one of the opportunities, but there are many other secure systems how to transfer data and give data access in controlled ways, and also understand the different alteration and utilization of the data on its way. So the technological platforms are all there. It's a question of culture, and it's a question of recognition, and a question of working at this in a consortial way, because I don't think a single entity can solve this. And that's the big challenge, and that's why I'm talking to you about this.
Thank you.